Hamish Cooper and his sister, Tabitha. For 2 years, this little boy fought a courageous battle with cancer.
The night that he died, when I knew that that was probably his last night, when it was clear that the levels of pain control were becoming less effective, there was a point in the small hours of the morning where he said to me, "Mama, I don't want so much pain." And I said, "Would you like me to take away the pain?" And he said, "Yes, please." And so I did give him a large dose of morphine, which certainly helped him die peacefully and in no pain.
You want to stop?
Alistair was beside me. We were all together. And Hamish was very brave.
Antonia and Alistair Cooper lost their little boy in 1981. Tabitha was only 5 when her brother died. According to the child psychiatrist, John Bowlby, an understanding of the attachments that bind a family together will help us to make sense of loss.
The days that followed his death were obviously sort of zombie-like. Except you must remember that I'd had 18 months to get used to that occasion. And one of the things we'd actually done even before his death, we'd even organized where he would be buried, because we knew that after his death it would be less easy to make that sort of decision. So those days went by with relatively few decisions to have to make because they'd all been done. And friends and acquaintances obviously came, or wrote, or phoned in large numbers. And people offered wonderful support. And then the weeks went by, and those people began to peel away. So that gradually we realized that they were getting on with their lives. And we felt we were getting deeper into some big black hole without Hamish.
Personally and professionally, family life is of great importance to John Bowlby. His own family, 4 children and 7 grandchildren, all live quite close to him in Hampstead. As a psychiatrist, Bowlby believes that stable family relationships are essential if individuals are to enjoy good mental health. He has been researching and writing about families for over 50 years. In his book on attachment, Bowlby investigates the infant's first and most important relationship. Without constant maternal love, a child will not develop securely. In the volume on separation, Bowlby examines the effects of a mother's absence, primitive responses of anxiety and anger, reflecting the child's overwhelming need to feel secure in a dangerous world. In the volume on loss, Bowlby explores the sadness and depression that are experienced when death makes separation permanent.
When a grown-up has lost someone, first of all, they are numb. They can't really register that anything frightful's happened. And then sooner or later, it hits them. And this is a very painful moment, of course. But there is a constant disbelief that it didn't really happen. And there's an oscillation, you see, between knowing it has happened and hoping and believing that it hasn't happened. And you might say these are quite contrary beliefs, but yet they're both held. A person first one way, first, and then the other. And it's only by talking about it and confirming, yes, it did happen, and where do we go from here, and all the implications, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth, that a grown-up gets over these, begins to get over these things. Well, now, I think the same is true of children. You see, many problems arise because children are not told, or they're not told the truth, or they're told the truth in a very inadequate way. And they don't have the chance of talking about it and challenging, how did it happen, why did it happen? It's very wrong that it should have happened. And protesting, you see, and so forth. Well, now, if children are given that opportunity to discuss it, especially within their own families with a surviving parent, they could go through all the same phases and they can get over it as an adult can, if they're allowed to go through all these phases. But you see, there's such a tendency to abort mourning in children. Either not to tell them or to tell them something or other and imply that, well, this is something that we needn't really worry about and so forth. And this is quite fatal.
Every Thursday at the St. Christopher's Hospice in South London, patients and their families can meet with the staff to enjoy a drink. Facing up to death and its consequences is the business of the hospice movement. The world's leading authority on bereavement is the psychiatrist Colin Murray Parkes.
Certainly working in a psychiatric setting, one's constantly driven back to looking for what went wrong in those patterns of attachment in early childhood. And it's perhaps not really surprising that the ways in which people feel about their parents colour the way they feel about other people of the same sex, about the people they love later in life, and affect not only their relationship with that person, but the way they react when that person dies. So that people who've been perhaps sensitized to loss by losses that have occurred early in life, maybe a parent has died or they've been separated for great lengths of time, and you get effects on the developing personality, so that people may either become very clinging, very inclined to overreact following quite minor separations, or they may even go to the opposite of extreme, of being afraid to make relationships, being turned in on themselves, withdrawn. In a sense, the only way to avoid grief is not to fall in love. And there's a sense in which some people who've been hurt by losses early in life may become afraid to fall in love, afraid of reaching out to other people. And this too may colour the relationships that they do make, so that they become afraid to touch, afraid to get close. And this itself produces complications in marriage and affects the way their whole life pursues its course and the way they react to subsequent losses.
This preschool nursery meets every day in the St. Christopher's Hospice. It's an amenity that the local community finds useful, and it helps the hospice staff. While they're busy in the wards, their children are in safe hands. A hospital for the terminally ill rings to the cheerful sound of children at play. Mingling the generations was a very deliberate policy when the hospice movement was born.
As far as I know, I only met John Bowlby once in my life, and this was because I'd written to Dr. Murray Parkes to say we were starting a hospice and that we wanted to look at the families as a whole. We wanted to have some understanding of problems of bereavement. And he invited me to lunch to meet him and John Bowlby. And in the course of lunch, we were talking about the numbers of my patients then at St. Joseph's Hospice who were able to face the truth of the fact that they were going to die. And I remember using the word saying, well, so often they say the hospice is a safe place. And Colin Parkes said, but how can you say safe when death is the most unsafe thing that can happen? And John Bowlby said, but I think you're using the wrong word. I think it really should be secure. He said, a child separated from its mother may be perfectly safe, but it feels very insecure. A child in its mother's arms in an air raid may be very unsafe indeed, but it feels quite secure. And I took from that we were trying to make a place which would be secure enough for people to face that sort of unsafety.
Sigmund Freud has a lot to answer for here. I mean, he was right to draw attention to the importance of early attachments, but it was unfortunate that he laid so much emphasis on the sexual component in attachment that he somehow failed to understand the way in which attachments are to do not so much with achievement of sexual gratification and orgasm, but achievement of security, and that the closeness between people owes as much to our need to protect each other in a dangerous world as it does to the need to beget children and have a sexual contact. And I think it was this overemphasis on sexuality which led to a lot of misunderstandings about what went on between mother and child during the early stages. And I think it's largely thanks to John Bowlby and others of that ilk who've studied early mother-child relationships in detail that we're only now beginning to get that clear.
When a patient is admitted to St. Christopher's, it is the job of social workers to help the dying and their relatives prepare for the inevitable in counselling sessions like this.
Robert.
Compiling a family tree helps to reveal the strengths and weaknesses of family attachments.
Called after his granddad. Well, it's very important to put him in. He may have died, but he's your child, and you were right. Perhaps because he is so important, and I guess often gets forgotten and left out by other people, we could return to talking about him a little bit later on. What about parents? I think grandparents are ever so important. They often spoil children, don't they? But you were saying, Helen, that your mother died of cancer.
Yeah.
Yes. What was that like? Can you tell me anything about it, the memories that come back?
Awful. She died in an awful lot of pain.
Did she?
And that's really all that I remember about it,
Hmm.
the fact that she suffered a lot. And I don't want that to happen with Bill.
Can I just say now that we shall do all we can to treat every little symptom of Bill's that comes up. And Bill, even when one is ill, one can still be strong for one's son, and we need to bring Michael into it as much as we can. And of course the children have a very important place here. Nothing escapes children. It isn't the words that are said, it's how they watch, isn't it? And so they need to be drawn into it too. And perhaps you'd like to bring them back with you when we could meet again and talk a little bit about their fears and some of their fantasies, perhaps, about what's really happening.
I'd like that.
I found in the past that whenever something gets published or someone appears on television talking about bereavement, half the correspondence seems to be from people who've suffered bereavements by divorce. And they always want to say, you know, it was just like that when my husband left me or my wife left me. There's no doubt that loss of a partner following a separation or divorce is a very painful kind of a grief. I think there are differences. When somebody you love dies, the tendency is, if anything, to idealize them. You remember the good things and you forget the bad things. I think following a divorce, you often do the opposite. It's almost as if you need to persuade yourself that the person who's left you wasn't really worth all that much. And people tend, if anything, to denigrate the memory of the person who they've become separated from.
I mean, all this divorce is certainly against the interests of stable and happy families. I do use the word happy. I use it rather a lot, because the question is, are people happy or not? To some extent, you see, family life is an investment. I've often made this point. Now, having children is hard work, but I would say that it pays off in the second half of your life, because you've got a built-in social circle. People who haven't got that sort of family life, when the older they get, the more isolated they get, the more lonely they get, and the more depressed they get.
In our society, traditional family life has been eroded. Divorce brings grief to many homes and to many thousands of children. In this fractured society, the gulfs between the generations appear to have widened. Many old people find the modern world increasingly hostile. The provision of institutional care for the elderly has become a growth industry. All the generations rarely live together nowadays, and as a consequence, we have become distanced from death. At the Helen House Hospice for Children, Mother Frances Dominica and her staff are with parents and children while they spend their last hours together.
A place like this would not be necessary if we lived in a different kind of society. Our experience has shown us that society tends to estrange people who are suffering this particular kind of grief, the loss of a child and the bereavement that follows the death of the child. And all we're doing is offering a very ordinary kind of friendship to people suffering an extraordinary kind of grief. There was one very beautiful autumn day, and a little boy of 10 months died here. And when he died, his mother carried him out into a quiet corner of the garden and simply sat holding him for a couple of hours in the garden, talking to him and crying. Mostly one of us was with her. Sometimes we let her be on her own with him for a while. And she sat remembering the time when he was born, also a very beautiful day. And then, when she was ready, she carried him back into their room and lay down with him on the bed. And she fell asleep for an hour, holding him. And then when she woke, she was ready to wash him and dress him with infinite care and tenderness in little clothes that she'd chosen specially for the occasion. And then she carried him to the small room where we have a cot ready. And she laid him in the cot. And over the next 2 or 3 days, she and the child's father went frequently to the room to be with him, to cry, to talk, gradually to come to terms as far as they were able with what had happened. And sometimes she'd lift him out of the cot again and hold him and uncurl his little fingers and look again and kiss him and just be lost in the wonder and the grief of it all. And I know that those days were very important to them. They knew that time was running out and soon he would be buried and they wouldn't see his body again. And they wanted to make the very most of the hours and the days that were left. That small room is very important, not just for the parents, but for brothers and sisters too. And of course, children are all individuals and they all react in different ways, but I'm quite sure that it's very important for them to be involved.
The decision came to ask Tabitha how she felt about the funeral, and she wanted to go. She also wanted to see the coffin before Hamish was put into it, so I took her along to another bedroom where it was, lying on a bed, and she inspected it and saw that it was just a box of wood, but lined like a little bed. And we talked about it, and I answered her questions. And the day of the funeral, she was completely normal in every respect. Some people might say that they thought she was a little extra jumpy But she was just a child, and she was coping in her way with a very important day. And we feel very sure that that was the right decision to make. But I know we were perhaps harshly judged by some for doing that. At the time Hamish died, I was heavily pregnant with our third child. One of my greatest fears during his last few weeks was of producing one baby on the very same day that I should lose another child. But our third child, Cassandra, was born in February 1982, only missing Hamish's birthday by 2 days, which was another thing that we found quite difficult. And because I had always been a coping person, I continued to put on my face in the morning. I continued to go to the supermarket and go through the shopping list. And even those very close to me never really began to feel what was thrashing around inside me was an absolute longing just to go to pieces, just to dig a big hole and to go into it and to see nobody and do absolutely nothing, and to scream and to wail and to beat my chest and to say, "Where is my son?"
One of the reasons that people find it difficult to grieve is that they're afraid of breaking down. Many people fear that if they don't control their feelings, they will literally go mad, that they'll have a breakdown. The truth of the matter is, from a psychiatric point of view, they're much more likely to have psychiatric problems, in a sense, to break down, than the people who express their grief freely from the start and, in a sense, get on with what Freud called the grief work, because grief is a job of work that needs to be done. Men in our society particularly prone to feel very ashamed of themselves if they get upset following a loss. And it doesn't feel to them that they're being manly if they start crying and showing their feelings. So there are very strong social pressures on people to suppress and inhibit grief. These compete with the internal pressures to do the opposite. The natural thing to do when you suffer a loss is to cry aloud and to stop everything else you're doing and get on with the business of searching for the person who's gone. But the intelligent human adult knows that that is A, a waste of time because you're not going to find them, and B, it's not respectable. It's not something that is regarded as good form in our society. So we're placed in a conflict. And in the early stages of grief, I think everybody resolves that conflict in their own particular way. Some people feel more free than others to express their feelings.
Well, when you're with any family who is losing or has lost a child, there's a bit in you which, not so much unfair as just this big question, why? You know, why? We don't understand. And when you're with families who are losing 2, 3, maybe 4 children of the same or different diseases, then it's just too big for my understanding anyway. And I don't have the answers, and I can't pretend I do. I think one of the most harmful things people can do is trip off pious platitudes, you know. It's hurtful. So many of the things that we say in an attempt to make it make sense just make the wound go deeper, I believe. I don't know of a reason. All I can do is try in my own way to stay alongside. I can't take the pain away, but perhaps in a very small way I can share it.
Child,